and welcome to today's webinar titled Letter to File 101. Are you sure you're preparing yours correctly? My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We've got a really special presentation scheduled for you today. I know our presenter, Mike Drews, is really looking forward to helping you learn the right way to prepare a letter to file so you can avoid future issues with the FDA or an even worse scenario. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy, Vascular Sciences, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for about 90 minutes in total and will include a question and answer session at the end where Mike will answer any questions you have. So I do encourage you to submit those questions throughout the webinar in the chat or the question section, and we'll get to as many of those as time permits. We will also be sharing the full recording of today's webinar with all registrants after the presentation ends, so keep an eye out for that email from us sometime later today. I'd also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you participated in one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. It's likely a similar mission to many of you who are tuning in now. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, and whether that's through hosting these free training sessions or by partnering with world-class medical device consultants like today's presenter, Mike, as well as through our award-winning quality management software. So for those of you who said you're interested in scheduling a brief intro call with us to learn how you can demonstrate full traceability by linking any item within Greenlight Guru, like change records, documents, risk management items, design controls, and so on, someone from our team will be reaching out to you after today's webinar. If you haven't connected with us yet, but you would like to, simply head over to www.greenlight.guru after the webinar and schedule a brief intro call with us to better understand how our purpose-built solution can best provide and serve your medical device needs. So in doing so, you'll learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging our purpose-built quality management software to meet other needs like market approval from the FDA, compliance with the EU MDR and IVDR, ISO 1345-2016 certification, as well as breeze through audits and push beyond baseline compliance to actually deliver true quality medical devices to patients. Okay. Now on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to your presenter today and a distinguished partner of ours at Greenlight Guru, Mike Drews. Mike Drews, PhD, is president of Vascular Sciences, a consulting and training company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission design, FDA presentation preparation, and defense. Mike is an internationally recognized expert who brings a breadth of knowledge and hands-on experience in his teachings from the ongoing work he does for FDA, Health Canada, and other regulatory and governmental agencies around the world. He's also a featured keynote speaker on cutting-edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs. So in addition to that, if any of you are familiar with the Global Medical Device Podcast, you'll recognize his voice right away as he's a longtime frequent guest on the show. So without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenter, Mike Drews. Take it away.
Thank you, Etienne, for that very kind and somewhat long introduction. I think we might have to cut that back a little bit in the future. And thank you to all of my friends at Greenlight for the opportunity to host this discussion today. And finally, thank you, all of you in the audience who are listening, not just right now in real time, but anybody that might be listening in the future, because if it weren't for you, we would all be just talking to ourselves. So the topic of today's webinar, as Etienne said, was Letter to File 101. Are you sure that you're preparing yours correctly? Etienne shared with you a little bit about my bio, so I'm not going to repeat that. I just want to emphasize two things. First of all, that in addition to webinars like this, I also participate regularly in the Greenlight podcast series, as well as other podcast series. I've been putting out a lot of webinars and podcasts and columns on a variety of different topics. You can see the different sites on the screen right now. And by the way, this slide, as well as all of the slides, will be in the handout that will be available after the webinar. The only other thing that I wanted to just emphasize quickly about my background is, in addition to consulting for a wide variety of medical companies, I also work as a consultant for the FDA as well as Health Canada and a few of the other regulatory agencies around the world. And the reason why I mention that, quite frankly, is there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence. And so I really try to use that to my advantage. So with that said, let's dig right into the topic for today, which is the letter to file. Some of the things that I want to try to hit in our time together is what is a letter to file and when and how should it be used? What goes into a letter to file? In other words, what should it contain? How does a letter to file compare to a special 510K or PMA supplement? And if you're not familiar with those things, don't worry, I'll talk a little bit about those later. Can a letter to file be used for a class 3 medical device, a PMA medical device? Is a letter to file faster and or less burdensome than if we were to notify the FDA? And finally, if you get sued, and the unfortunate reality is that if you're in business long enough, at least here in the United States, you will get sued. I can just about guarantee it. How can a letter to file be used against you? And throughout the entire webinar, I'm going to be sharing with you as many tips and tricks as I can from my 30 years of experience of playing this game. And then we'll wrap this up at the very end with a few thoughts. And as Etienne said, we'll have some question and answer discussion, which I think is the most valuable portion of our time together. So as a reminder, I just want to echo what was said before. As questions come up, please do type them into the chat box so that we can talk about them on the other side of this webinar. Okay, so let's begin with the first question, and that is, why is a letter to file important? Before we get into what goes into it and how you put it together and how you use it and so on, why is it important? Well, the short answer is it's part of the overall change management process, if you will. Medical devices, unlike drugs, are under almost a constant state of change. In other words, in the drug world, for example, once a drug company gets a drug through the FDA and onto the market, they really don't want to change anything about that drug. And I literally mean anything. But in the medical device world, it's almost the opposite. And by the way, for the moment, I'm talking primarily about the class 2 and the class 1 medical device world. We'll talk a little more about the class 3 world in a few minutes. And for those of you that are relatively new to this, and if you're not familiar with the medical device classification system, I did do a webinar specifically on medical device classification for Greenlight. You can find it on their website, or if you can't find it, send me an email. I'll be happy to give you access to it. So what we're talking about here is change management primarily for class 2 or lower devices, because medical device companies are constantly changing devices while they're on the market. In the class 3 universe, we can still make changes, but we don't have quite as much freedom to operate, so to speak. But in the class 2 and lower world, we have a lot of freedom to operate. And so this whole topic of letter to file falls under the topic of change management. A couple of reasons why that this topic is important, though, the change management, is that this is one of the most common reasons why companies get 483 observations and warning letters, because of change management or the lack thereof. In other words, you as a company make a change to your medical device that's on the market. You don't notify FDA of that change, perhaps because you did a letter to file. FDA comes knocking on your door. They say, hey, we happen to notice that you made a change to your medical device. We don't remember you ever coming and talking to us about that. What the heck is going on? We'll talk about that scenario in more detail in just a few minutes, but I see that scenario happen very, very frequently. So one of the reasons why this is important is because it's such a common reason why FDA issues 483 and observations and warning letters. The other reason, quite frankly, to be blunt, is that the industry standard is wrong. Flat out wrong. I know this might sound harsh to some people, but it is absolutely 100% backwards. What most companies do, if they're going to make a change to a medical device, they decide, are they going to do a letter to file, or are they going to notify the FDA, as we'll talk about, either with a special 510K or perhaps a PMA supplement, and then they go through the analysis and the testing to see if that change is significant and so on. In my opinion, that's totally backwards. And I advise all of the customers that I work with not to do it that way, because that's one of the reasons why so many companies get in trouble. Instead, what we should do is we should, and we'll talk more about this in more detail in a moment, but we should do that analysis first. In other words, we should do the testing to show that the change that we're making is not significant. It's not going to introduce new questions of safety and efficacy. It's not going to change the overall risk and so on. And then at the end of that process, not at the beginning, but at the end of that process, we decide, what do we do with that information? Do we notify the FDA with either a special 510K or a PMA supplement, or do we simply keep that information internal via a letter to file? The letter to file is obviously what we're focusing on here, but the scenario is you have a device on the market under a 510K, de novo, PMA, HDE, what have you. You want to make a change to that device in some way. Could be a change in the labeling, could be a change in the design, mechanism of action, material, what have you. Do you notify the FDA or not? And if so, how do you notify them? Now, for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to assume that we're going in the letter to file direction, because that's the topic of this webinar. If you're interested, sorry, let me just back up for a second. If you're interested in the more broad topic of change management, I did an entire webinar for Greenlight a few years ago. It's available on their website. It's in the handout for this presentation. If you can't find it, send me an email. I'd be happy to send it to you, where I go into a much, much deeper dive into how you make that decision as to whether you notify the FDA or not. But for the purposes of today's webinar, we're going to assume that you've gone through that analysis, and your decision, right or wrong, your decision is not to notify the FDA, and therefore you're going to do what we call a letter to file. So you want to make a change to your device, your existing device, already on the market. How do you decide whether you need to notify the FDA? Well, in a nutshell, you have to ask yourself the question, can those proposed changes affect the safety and efficacy, performance, risk, and so on of the new device? And the reason why I put the word new in air quotes here is because I'm talking about the changed device. I'm not talking about the previous version, the predicate, if you will. And by the way, pun intended, I'm talking about the new device. Can those proposed changes affect the safety, efficacy, performance, risk, and so on of the new device? What's the impact on labeling? What's the impact on usability? What's the impact on risk? You need to have a process, and again, we'll talk a little more about this later, but you need to have your own process with very, very specific criteria, and you need to validate that process, and all of that process should be in your quality management system, specifically under the topic of change management. So whether you do a letter to file or a special 510K or a PMA supplement, what should you document? Well, if you're going to notify the FDA, then that's fairly easy, because they've put guidance out there on the special 510K. I'll share that with you in a moment. They've put guidance out there on PMA supplements and so on and so on. But if you're not going to notify the FDA, if you are going to do the letter to file, there's no guidance on that. There's no template for that. I can't tell you how many of my customers say, well, Mike, where's the FDA guidance on the letter to file? Where's FDA's template on the letter to file? Well, quite frankly, why the heck would they put out a guidance on the letter to file when you never send the letter to file to the FDA? It makes absolutely no sense. So the format of the letter to file, as well as the content of the letter to file, is totally up to you. The question is that a good thing or a bad thing? I personally view it as a very good thing, because it gives me a lot of flexibility as to how to organize it, what kind of information to put in there, and so on. But unfortunately, for a lot of people, it's a bad thing, because they don't know, quite frankly, what they're doing. They don't know what to put in there, and so on. And that's the purpose of this webinar. But here's a place to start. Obviously, start with, what is the change? Why are you making it? How did you test it? That's the most important thing. And what are the consequences of that change, and how will you monitor them later in the form of post-market surveillance and so on? All of this stuff would normally be in a special 510K. All of this stuff should be in a letter to file as well. Okay, so this is just the beginning. We're going to get into more details of this as we continue. However, as we're also going to talk about later, for any of you remember the old bug Bugs Bunny cartoon, the character Elmer Fudd, be very, very careful what you put in the letter to file, because that can turn around and bite you in the you-know-what later on. If and when you get sued from the product liability perspective. And again, I'll talk more about that. So for those of you that know me or listen to my podcast, you know that I spend a fair amount of my time working as an expert witness in medical device product liability cases. And as we'll talk about later, one of the first things that I ask for during discovery is the letter to files. In other words, I want to, obviously the opposing counsel is going to give me the documentation that was submitted to the FDA. That's a no-brainer. But what I immediately ask for is what documentation was not submitted to the FDA, i.e. the letter to file. So one of the interesting aspects of putting together a letter to file is that you have to be aware that this could be used against you in a product liability case in the future. Here are some additional resources that you might want to check out from FDA on the special, on the when to notify the FDA if you make a change or not. I'm not going to go through these, but the one on the left is for general medical devices. The one on the right is specifically for software as a medical device, SAMDs. The principles, as I said, are explained in much, much more detail in my best practices for medical device change management. Don't use the FDA as an excuse to hold you back webinar that I did for Greenlight. Again, it's available on their website. I highly recommend checking it out if you're making a change to a medical device that's on the market, because there's so many companies that get in trouble for this. And quite frankly, it's there's no reason why any company should ever get in trouble for this if, underline if, you do it properly. But unfortunately, not everybody does it properly. So we're focusing, as I said, on the letter to file. So we're assuming that we're not going to notify the FDA with a special 510K or a PMA supplement. So that's what we're going to take a deeper dive into right now. So continuing the question of what is a letter to file and when and how should it be used? Well, if you decide, as we just talked about, that you are not going to notify the FDA of your change because it's not necessary, and by the way, not necessary does not necessarily equal is not required. In other words, and I've gone through this process many times with many different companies over many years, at the end of the day, it's really a business decision. In spite of the, let me just back up to the previous screen for just a second. In spite of the guidance that FDA has put out, I can, how do I say this? I can manipulate these flowcharts, for example, to give me almost any answer that I want. Literally any answer that I want as to whether I notify the FDA or whether I don't need to notify the FDA. So in spite of the guidance, at the end of the day, it's really a business decision. Does the company want to notify the FDA of their change? Or does the company not notify FDA and simply keep that internal? There are advantages and disadvantages to both of those approaches. Some people have suggested, well, maybe the medical device world should be a little bit more like the drug world. In other words, not allow medical device companies as great of a flexibility as they have today, and make sure that all changes that happen to medical devices go through the FDA. That would be a very, very easy regulation to insert. It would just take a nanosecond. We can do it in a heartbeat. The question is, would we want to do that? Well, in my opinion, absolutely not. Why? Because first of all, we would stifle innovation in the medical device industry quite a bit, even more than it is now. Kind of like the challenges that we have in the drug world, and I work in the drug world as well. But equally problematic with imposing regulation like that is I guarantee it would immediately bring the medical device industry to a grinding halt, because FDA would be so inundated with all of the changes. As a matter of fact, as I tell my FDA friends, and remember, as I said at the beginning, I work as a consultant for the FDA, so I see a lot of these issues from both sides. FDA has no idea, literally no idea, how many changes that that medical devices go through while they're on the market, because FDA is not notified of them, because the companies are doing this letter to file. So in my opinion, and Maybe some people might disagree. I don't know. That's fine. But in my opinion, we don't want to make this more stringent. But what we do need to do is make sure that the people working in this industry know what the heck they're doing. And that's not always a good assumption to make. Present company excluded, of course. So assuming that you are not going to notify the FDA and you've made that determination, then obviously the letter to file is the tool that you're going to use. So why create a letter to file? Because it's not required. You could just simply make, theoretically anyway, you could simply make a change to your medical device and not have any kind of a documentation for it, any kind of a letter to file. It would absolutely not be my recommendation. So why create a letter to file? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, I do think it's important to document the change. So what change that we're making, when we're making it, why we're making it, most importantly, the kind of testing that we've done to support it. And by the way, when I say testing or data, I don't necessarily mean testing in the literal or the engineering sense of the word. It might just very well be that you could get information from the literature. You can get information from subject matter experts. You can get information from previous use of the device, real world evidence, if you will. You could even make common sense, logical arguments that require no evidence whatsoever. But you need to have some supportive information to document the change. Okay, so that's one of the reasons, in my opinion. That's not a real important reason why we do the letter to file, but it certainly is one of the reasons. The real reason why we do the letter to file is it forces us to go through this analysis. In other words, we need to show that our new device, in other words, our changed device, is substantially equivalent to our original or our predicate device. And for those of you that are familiar with the 510K world, please notice I am using these puns very intentionally, because we literally want to show that our new or changed device, whatever changes that we're making, whether they be changes in labeling, design, material, manufacturing method, whatever it is, I don't really care what the change is. Whatever change that we're making, it is substantially equivalent to the original, to the pre-changed version, to the version that's already on the market. That's what the purpose of this whole process is, and that's what the purpose of the letter to file is. So putting it in slightly different words, a letter to file is substantially equivalent, again, pun intended, substantially equivalent to a special 510K. It's just that you don't submit it to the FDA, you submit it, so to speak, internally. That is, you submit it to yourself, you submit it to the company. And unless something really bad happens, nobody is ever going to see your letter to file. As a matter of fact, and I'm kind of dating myself here, but sometimes people ask me, well, Mike, why do we call this the letter to file? Or some people refer to it as the note to file. The reason is because we would create this paper document and we would literally put it in our 3-drawer file cabinet. And unless something bad happens, nobody would ever see it. It would never see the light of day. So a letter to file is substantially equivalent to a special 510K. And in a nutshell, for those of you that are not familiar with the special 510K, and this is another reason why so many people get in trouble, because I've had customers come to me and they say, can you help me with my letter to file? And I say, sure. Are you familiar with the special 510K process? And they say, no. Well, why the heck are you putting together a letter to file if you don't know about the special 510K and how to use it and what goes into it and so on? I mean, to me, I hate to be harsh here, but you really shouldn't be doing this if that's the case. It's like, a surgeon who doesn't know how to do surgery in a different method. It's just another method of doing exactly the same thing. So in a nutshell, a special 510K is one of several types of 510Ks. But the thing that's special, if you will, about the special 510K is it's typically used for in situations where we already have a device on the market and we're making a change to that device, and we need to notify the FDA of that change. That's why it's so similar to the letter to file. The only difference is that with the special 510K, the notification is to the FDA. We submit it to the FDA, and of course they're going to take some time to go through it and evaluate it and so on. Whereas the letter to file, we're submitting it, if you will, to ourselves. quite frankly, that is the only difference, certainly the only significant difference between the two. And if you approach it from that perspective, I can just about guarantee you're going to have a much lower likelihood of having problems in the future than many companies run into today. For those of you that are not familiar with the 510K or specifically the concept of substantial equivalence, I did a webinar for Greenlight specifically on substantial equivalence. Pardon me. I take a very deep dive into substantial equivalence. So really, and I mean this with all due respect, if you don't have a good understanding of substantial equivalence, you need to understand that first better before you start constructing a letter to file, because the idea is exactly the same. And there's a third reason why the letter to file is important, to cover your you-know-what, so to speak. Imagine this not so hypothetical scenario. The FDA comes knocking on your door. They say, gee, we noticed that you changed this medical device that we cleared some months or years ago. We don't remember you ever coming and talking to us about this change. What the heck is going on? In a situation like this, and I see it happen all the time, I don't want to be in a situation where I say, oh, gee, I forgot, or worse, oh, gee, you caught me. I want to be able to say, oh, no, Mr. and Mrs. FDA Inspector, come on in, sit down, have a cup of coffee. I don't know, are we allowed to offer them coffee anymore? I'm not sure. Let me pull out my letter to file, which has the full justification, the full documentation of not just what the change is, but why we did it, the data that we have to support that the change is not significant, that it doesn't introduce new questions of safety, efficacy, doesn't change the overall risk, and so on. In other words, I want to make it painfully obvious to my FDA friends, painfully obvious, that I know what the heck that I'm doing, that I'm not simply forgetting something, that I'm certainly not taking shortcuts, that I know what that I'm doing. And at the end of the day, that I made a business decision that I was not required to notify FDA because of this change. And here are all the reasons why. The reason why I give that advice to my customers, quite frankly, is because worst case scenario, and this is the absolute worst case scenario, if FDA sees it differently, if they say, gee, we understand, thank you for explaining all that, we should, we think that you should have notified us anyway, fine, no problem. I'll take that information out of my letter to file. I will put it into a new package. I'll call it a special 510K, and I'll say, you'll have it next week. Again, at the end of the day, I want to make sure that my friends on the FDA side of the table know that I know what I'm doing. It's not a matter of taking shortcuts. That's another frustration that I have with a lot of folks in this industry. They view the letter to file as taking a shortcut. As we'll talk about later, in a certain sense, it might be viewed as a shortcut in terms of time, because obviously we don't have to wait a few months for FDA to review the special 510K if we do it as a letter to file. But other than that, the substance, the technical content especially, is exactly the same. Whether you do it in a letter to file or a special 510K, or as we'll talk about later, as a PMA supplement, the content, which is the most important, that's exactly the same. So one of the things that I hope everybody takes away from this webinar is that be careful about viewing the letter to file as a shortcut, because that's exactly the kind of thinking that gets so many people in this business in trouble. And the consequences of your decision, whether it's to notify the FDA or not, is going to have regulatory implications. For example, if and when you get audited, or if and when you go to the FDA with a new submission, maybe for a next generation of that device, it's going to potentially have product liability ramifications, because, as I said, one of the first things that I ask for as an expert witness is not simply the documentation that the company has sent to the FDA, but I want to see the documentation that was not sent to the FDA. Like, for example, I want to see all of the letter to files. And of course, I also think that if the letter to file happens to be the right thing to do, although maybe I just fell off the turnip truck last week, maybe I'm just being naive, but nonetheless, I do think that it's the right thing to do. Continuing on, so let's get a little bit more specific now. As a reminder, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box so we can talk about them when we finish. What goes into a letter to file? In other words, what kind of information should it contain? Well, fundamentally, it should contain the same basic information that the special 510K does. That is, the description of the of the change device, the new device, the any labeling and so on and so on. But the most important part of the submission, if you will, submission to ourselves, the most important part of the submission is the substantial equivalence argument to show that whatever change, singular, or changes plural, that we've made to our new device, it's still substantially equivalent to the previous, to the predicate, to the pre-change device. That is the most important part of the letter to file, along with the risk section of the letter to file, to make sure that we can demonstrate that there aren't any new risks that were created as a result of these changes, and to make sure that we have not increased the level of known risks based on the changes that we've made to our device. For those of you that are very familiar with the 510K, this should sound absolutely 100% familiar to you, because what have I just done? I have just reiterated exactly what the 510K requirements are. We need to show specifically that there are no new questions of safety and efficacy. That's 510K requirement number one. And then 510K requirement number two is involving risk. We need to show that there's not a change in the overall risk. And if we were to parse the risk part of the equation a little bit further, and for those of you that are interested, I am a subject matter expert for FDA in several areas, one of them being risk. I did a webinar for Greenlight on risk. It's what I call my 3-bucket approach to risk. I would encourage you to take a look at that if you have not done so already. But specifically the risk requirements for the 510K, which in my opinion are exactly the same, not even substantially equivalent, but exactly the same as the risk requirements for a letter to file, is you need to show that there are no new risks in your new or changed device. That's risk requirement number one. And risk requirement number two is of the known or the existing risks. You need to show that there's not an increase in the known or existing risks. In other words, you need to demonstrate that the level of risk for the known risk is the same or lower than it is in the predicate, in the pre-changed version of the device. So if you apply this kind of level, and it sounds more complicated than it is, it's really not that complicated. But if you apply this level of analysis, I can just about guarantee that if anybody, including FDA, does challenge you on your letter to file decision, you will be very, very well equipped to defend yourself, and likely to defend yourself successfully if you've gone through that kind of analysis, if you think about it in those 510K requirement terms. Unfortunately, it's painfully obvious to me that most people and most companies don't do that, because that's exactly why they get in trouble in so many situations. So what are the most important sections of the letter to file? Well, you make a template. FDA doesn't provide a template, and in my opinion, they should not provide a template, because remember, you're not sending this to them unless something really bad happens. Make a template. That should go in your QMS as part of your change management section. And I have a template of my own that I give to my customers, but it's not rocket science. You can certainly make a template yourself. Where would you go for inspiration as a starting point? Well, take a look at what FDA has already put out there. You can go to, here's FDA's website on how to prepare a special 510K, and FDA has put out a guidance on the special 510K. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by going through the guidance and showing you what FDA thinks are the important information. It's all there for you to see. So you can start with their guidance, if you will, and use that to create your own template. But there are a lot of modifications that I've made to mine, because in some cases I agree with what FDA suggested, in other cases I don't. So make a template. You have a lot of freedom to operate. You might as well utilize that freedom to operate, as long as, and this is the important caveat, as long as your decisions are based on engineering and biology, not on the regulation. Then you're going to be on very solid ground to stand on. But if you make decisions based only on regulation that are not founded in the engineering and the biology, that's when you're standing on quicksand, and that's when you're probably going to get in trouble. And beyond just that particular guidance, also take advantage of the acceptance checklist, the RTA, the refuse to accept checklists that FDA has put out in lots of different areas, including in the 510K. And there is a special 510K RTA checklist. So take a look at the guidance. I'm sorry, take a look at the website. Here's the guidance for the RTA checklist specifically. Well, there's a section of this guidance specifically for the special 510K. Obviously, you can use a little bit of common sense here for the portions of the sections that talk about, notifying the FDA and so on. Obviously, you don't need to include that. Although I do, in my template, I do advise companies as part of your letter to file, and this is an important point, have a section in there explaining your justification, your rationale for why you are choosing the letter to file. In other words, why are you choosing not to notify the FDA? And instead of doing a special 510K or a PMA supplement. I strongly believe that that justification should be in there. You should explain in detail your reasoning why that change or changes that you're making to your device do not require notification of the FDA. Now, some companies don't want to do that because that might, put them in a difficult situation to defend themselves. Well, I would argue that if you have a solid defense, then I wouldn't worry about that. If you have a strong rationale, a strong justification for why notifying the FDA is not necessary. I don't want to use the word required because that kind of implies that this is black and white, and there's nothing about this that's black and white, absolutely nothing. But if you have a strong rationale of why it's not necessary to notify the FDA, because as I said earlier, at the end of the day, this is oftentimes a business decision as much as anything else. You should have nothing to hide, nothing to worry about, nothing to hide about. And don't forget, as I mentioned earlier, that this process, this template, this whatever you want to call it, how you handle change, under what circumstances do you decide to notify the FDA, and under what circumstances you do not. And if you don't notify the FDA via a letter to file, for example, what goes into that letter to file, all of that should be in your quality management system. All of it should be in your quality management system. And I see a lot of companies that I work with, when I look at their QMS, it's either in there at a very, very high level, like we're going to follow the FDA flowchart to determine whether we need to notify them or not. Well, with all due respect, first of all, it's a statement of the obvious, but more importantly, it doesn't tell me anything. Literally anything, because as I said earlier, I can follow the flow chart and come up with whatever answer that I want to come up with. You need to really have more specific detail about how that particular procedure is going to be applied to your products, and even use your devices as an example. If you've made a change to one of your devices and you've gone through that letter to file process, use that perhaps as an example. Put it into your quality management system if you think it's a good example, so that future changes to your device can be handled in a similar way. That's the whole point of having a quality management system. A few more things to talk about, and then we're going to move on to the question section at the end. What does a letter to file cost in a monetary sense? Well, from a user fee perspective, there's no fee to the FDA, paid to the FDA. That's a statement of the obvious to me, because you're not submitting anything to the FDA, so there's no MEDUFA user fee involved. Obviously, there is a cost to the company in terms of the time and the effort to put it together, as well as maybe some testing and so on that you might have to do. But I would like to think that most companies would just view that as a cost of doing business. In other words, I certainly would hope that a company's not going to do the testing to support a letter to file simply because they don't want to spend the time or the money. I mean, companies like that, they should not be in this business. But unfortunately, I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. There are some companies, hopefully not a lot, but some companies that view it exactly that way. They view the letter to file as a shortcut, as an excuse not to do certain things. And as a result, they make changes to their medical devices that are on the market without properly vetting them, without properly analyzing or testing them. And in some cases, people can get harmed, and in some cases, even worse. And there's one thing that I guarantee: the more companies that do that, the more likely we're going to lose more and more of our freedom to operate. In other words, the more likely the medical devices world, especially the class 2 and lower world, we'll get to class 3 in just a moment, but the class 2 or lower world, it's going to come to look like the drug world, where companies are absolutely adverse to make any change to a product, literally any change. Once it's through the FDA and onto the market, once they got an NDA if it's a drug or a BLA if it's a biologic, because of all of the, let me call them issues or challenges, if you will, of taking those changes to the FDA. I hope that doesn't happen to the medical device world, and I don't think it will happen to the medical device world if we continue to act as medical device professionals. And I'm not using that word professional lightly. As a matter of fact, I'm using it very seriously, because if I call myself a medical device professional, along with that title comes the responsibility of knowing what to do and how to do it and how to do it properly and so on. Exactly like if you needed surgery, the surgeon is expected to know how to do the surgery, and not just how to do that surgery, but what happens if this happens, what happens if that happens, what happens, what are the alternative surgeries or alternative methods of treating that particular problem, and so on and so on. Surgeons are professionals. Medical devices, folks, if they want to be professionals, we should be held to that same standard, if you will. Ignorance is not an excuse. And finally, if we don't spend the time and money doing a letter to file properly, I know a lot of companies, they do letter to files, but a lot of them that I see are 100% crap. I'm going to be just blunt here, 100% crap, just like as an FDA consultant. Sometimes the submissions that I see come into the agency are 100% crap. I mean, literally, they are painful to read. Sometimes I wonder if they teach, in an elementary school anymore, how to construct a sentence with a noun and a verb. I mean, some of you might think I'm joking. I'm really not. They are literally painful to read. So if you don't take the time and the money to prepare a letter to file properly, just like you would be submitting it to the FDA, it can actually potentially cost you huge in the long run in terms of fines. And I've seen it happen where companies get, as I said earlier, 43 observations, warning letters. In some cases, it might even lead to a recall of a device. All of this stuff is 100% avoidable if we do this properly. And I included, for the sake of completeness in the handout, the current MDUFA user fees. You'll notice on here that there are 510K fees and so on. There are no letter to file fees. There is a PMA supplement fee. I'll talk more about supplements, PMA supplements, in just a moment. But there is a PMA supplement fee. If you're going to submit a special 510K, that would have the same fee as any other type of 510K, about $13,000 for a standard company and about $3,000 for a small company. Although I work with a lot of small companies, so here's a little tip for the small company. If you want to get a small company discount on either a 510K or anything else, you need to first get, what the heck do they call it now? I can't remember. It's some sort of like a small company designation number from the FDA. That process by itself can take up to 2 months. So allow enough time, if you're going to submit a 510K or a 513G or a de novo or something like that, figure a couple of months to just simply qualify for the small business discount. It's not difficult to qualify for. It's just that it takes our US government quite a bit of time sometimes to do a seemingly simple thing. Don't even get me started on that. Okay, the couple more things I want to talk about, and then we'll move on to the question section. How does a letter to file compare to a special 510K? We've already talked about that, or more particularly, a PMA supplement. That's the part that we're going to get into here. Well, as I've tried to stress thus far, the principles, the regulatory logic is exactly the same. In other words, whether we're talking about notifying the FDA via a special 510K or a PMA supplement, or not notifying the FDA, i.e. a letter to file, the content is exactly the same. The amount of work that we have to do, the regulatory burden, the literature review, the testing, the comparison to other devices, or in our case, a comparison to the unchanged device, what I'm calling the predicate device, it is exactly the same. You might, as a matter of fact, taking that one step further, and I talk about exactly how to do this in my substantial equivalence webinar that I referred to earlier. You might actually do a head-to-head comparison, an apples-to-apples comparison, where you have your changed version of your device and your previous version of your device, and you literally subject them both to the same tests. If it's a catheter, for example, you put them through a torture track, or you pull on them, or you push on them, or you twist on them, or you measure the friction of the coating, or what have you, and you compare apples to apples comparison, the changed version to the pre-changed version in a substantial equivalence like way. And if you can show that there's not a significant difference, then that's part of your justification for why that change is not significant. Okay, so the principles, the logic, the regulatory burden is exactly the same. Although you do have, as I mentioned earlier, more, as my attorney friends like to call, freedom to operate, more wiggle room in the class 2 or class 1 universe. In the class 3 universe, you have much less freedom to operate. In other words, as a general rule, you have much less flexibility to make changes to a device that's on the market as a class 3 device, as a PMA, or possibly an HDE. And the question is why? And this is another thing that frustrates me about a lot of folks that work in regulatory. When I, as an engineer, ask why do I have to do something? Oftentimes the regulatory person will say, well, because that's what the regulation says. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not a good reason for me, right? That's like a parent saying to their 2-year-old child, you have to do X. The child says, why do I have to do that? And the parent responds by saying, well, I'm the parent, you have to do what I say. Okay, fine. That might work when you're 2 years old, but that should not be a reason why we do anything, or it should not be a reason why we don't do anything as adults, as professionals working in this industry. So why do we have less freedom to operate in the class 3 universe when it comes to making changes without notifying the FDA? The answer is very simple. Class 3 devices are typically more risky devices. The technologies are typically more complex. The patients usually have additional comorbidities. The designs are oftentimes more complicated. The manufacturing methods are more complicated. In some cases, in the class 3 universe, we're talking about truly a life or death kind of a situation. In other words, if the device works, the patient lives. If it doesn't work, the patient dies. We can't usually say that with class 2 or certainly class 1 devices, but we can say that with many class 3 devices. And so it makes sense that we need to have a little more of a safety valve, if you will, a backup, a redundancy built into the system that we don't have in the class 2 or 1 universe that we need in the class 3 universe. And that backup, that redundancy, is the FDA. Because their job in those situations, especially in the class 3 world, is to make sure that the reasons why we're making the change to our class 3 device are justified, and they won't raise additional questions of safety and efficacy. Pardon me, they don't change the overall risk and so on. Believe me, I wish that we wouldn't need the FDA to do this. In fact, I've said this in some of my public presentations before. I really wish that we worked in an industry where we didn't need the FDA, where companies and the people in them did the things that we all know that we should do. But unfortunately, I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. There are some people, I'm certainly not trying to imply that this applies to everybody, that there are some companies and people in them that genuinely do stupid things. And believe me, both as a regulatory consultant, but especially as an expert witness in medical device product liability cases, I see sometimes companies and people in them do genuinely stupid things. I don't know how to sugarcoat it any more than that, but they genuinely do stupid or boneheaded things. So that's the justification for why we have less flexibility, less freedom to operate in the class 3 universe than we do in the class 2 universe. But we still have some freedom to operate in the class 3 universe without notifying the FDA. So the next question is, can a letter to file be used for a class 3 PMA or HDE medical device? The short answer is yes, it can, but, And here's the important but, as I mentioned earlier, as Elmer Fudd said in the Bugs Bunny cartoon, be very, very careful, because you got a lot less flexibility in the class 3 universe than you do in the class 2 universe for 510Ks or de novos. And in the class 1 universe, especially for exempt devices, we have almost an infinite amount of freedom to operate. It's a little bit scary there. But in the class 2 universe, 510Ks and de novos, we have some freedom to operate. But in the PMA, the class 3 universe, we have just a tiny bit of freedom to operate. So what exactly does that freedom to operate mean? Well, first we have to look at some scenarios where a PMA supplement would be required. And on FDA's website, and I have the reference in the handout, you can go and read all of it. Here are some examples of changes to a PMA device that would require some notification to the FDA. For example, if you're adding a new indication for use, that's a no-brainer. And by the way, that's the same thing for a class 2 device. If you're adding a new indication for use, if your device, if say it's a 510K device, if your device is originally cleared for, I'm just going to make something up, diabetes, and you want to add a new indication, let's say cancer, I hope everybody appreciates that you absolutely cannot in no way, shape, or form do that under a letter to file. That has to be vetted through the FDA with either a new 510K or in certain circumstances, possibly a de novo. But that is absolutely not something that the company can do on their own. And I would like to think that we would not need regulation to tell us that. I would like to think that that would be common sense. But unfortunately, you know what they say about common sense, it's not as common as we would like to think. Other kinds of labeling changes oftentimes have to be vetted in the class 3 universe through the FDA in a PMA supplement. Even changing the manufacturing facility, that needs to be notified to the FDA. Again, what's the reason why? Here's what the regulation says, but it doesn't usually say why. We have to ask the question why. Well, because of the risks of the products, because the technology is oftentimes more complicated, the manufacturing methods probably are going to be more complicated. And at the end of the day, especially in the PMA universe, we need to make darn sure that whatever changes that we make, even if we're just moving to a building across the street, a different facility, we need to make sure that the devices coming out of that new facility are the same as the devices coming out of the older facility. So I think that's a perfectly reasonable request. Changes in the manufacturing methods or the quality control procedures. Some of you, if you're involved in the regulatory side, you know that in the 510K and the de novo universe, there's absolutely no requirement anywhere in a 510K or de novo to include your manufacturing methods as part of your submission. In the PMA world, there is. A portion of your PMA submission is devoted to the manufacturing methods. Why? Because again, it has to do with the risks and the complexity of the technology and so on. So that's a difference. If we change the sterilization methods, if we change the packaging, if we change the performance or the design specifications, even if we change the expiration date, all of these things would require a notification to the FDA in the class 3 universe. Some of them, underline some of them, may be required in the class 2 universe, some of them may not. So, but again, sticking in the class 3 universe, changes without a PMA supplement, you can see on the bottom. An applicant may, and I don't know why they call it an applicant, because there's nothing submitted to the FDA, so there's no, why do we call it an applicant? But anyway, that's a minor thing. An applicant may make a change to a device after FDA's approval of the PMA without submitting a PMA supplement, if the change does not affect the device's safety or effectiveness, or if the change, that's requirement number one. However, we still have to notify, in most cases, the FDA of the change as part of our post-approval periodic reports, our annual PMA reports, which, by the way, is another requirement of most PMAs. You need to submit an annual report as part of your post-market surveillance for a PMA device. That's usually not the case for 510K or de novo devices, although, as some of you know, in the EU, post-market surveillance requirements are increasing, and In the United States, they're starting to increase as well. This is a topic of a different discussion, but I think, quite frankly, the simple reason why in the EU, for example, the post-market surveillance requirements are increasing so much is because, quite frankly, our industry has done a really crappy job overall with doing post-market surveillance. Again, I hate to be blunt, but I don't know a better way to put it. Our industry overall, I'm not talking about specific companies, I'm just saying the industry overall has done a pretty crappy job. Think about it this way. If our industry has done a good job with post-market surveillance in the past, do you think the regulatory authorities in the EU or the US or elsewhere would increase the post-market surveillance requirements? Absolutely not. So it stands to reason that the reason why they're doing this is because we have some people in our industry, regrettably, and I take no pleasure in saying this about my own industry, but we have some people in our industry who are not doing, things that, quite frankly, we should do, and as a result, they're now making the requirements more stringent. If you are going to submit a PMA supplement, there's a number of different types of PMA supplements. Again, here are just some examples from FDA's website, but you got to remember the why. Why is a PMA supplement, which is in many, many ways very, very similar, if not substantially equivalent to a special 510K. The only difference is that a special 510K, as the name implies, would be for class 2 devices, whereas a PMA supplement would be for a class 3 device, but at the end of the day, they're basically the same thing. For those of you that are interested in more detail in the PMA universe, including supplements, PMA supplements, I would refer you to the PMA, the pre-market approval webinar that I did for Greenlight, where I take a much deeper dive into the PMA, primarily the pre-market requirements, but I also get into the post-market requirements, including post-market surveillance and the manufacturing requirements and so on and so on. A couple of last questions, and then we're going to be at the end for our Q&A session. So again, as a reminder, if you haven't already, if you think of a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box so that Eddie and I can discuss them afterwards. Is the letter to file faster or less burdensome than notifying the FDA? Many, many people would say yes. I say yes and no. Yes, it's faster in the sense that you don't have to wait for FDA to review all of this information and get back to you, which can take, in many cases, a few months. Yeah, I know the guidance says 30 days. Well, you should not take any of the numbers that you see in guidance or even in regulation with a grain of salt, because there are so many ways that those numbers can be manipulated, and that's a topic of a different discussion. But bottom line, you do have to allow for the FDA the time to evaluate the information that you sent them. That stands to reason. But other than that, the time that it takes you to put together the information that goes into your letter to file would be very, very similar, i.e. substantially equivalent to the time that you would need to put together that information if you were putting it in a special 510K or in a PMA supplement. So let me see if I can explain this a little bit more clearly. The time that you take to describe your rationale, to collect your information, to do your analysis, and to do your testing if necessary, that is going to be exactly the same regardless if you take this information to the FDA or you keep it internal. That's the same. The difference is what happens after that point. If you don't, if you deem it not necessary to submit it to the FDA, then obviously you don't have to worry about the FDA taking time to review it and get back to you. But here's another suggestion I often make to the companies that I work with. In your quality management system, as part of your change control, if you determine for a particular change that it's not necessary to notify the FDA and you're going to handle that letter to file internally, which I have no problem with, you should have some internal mechanism in place in your company to review that letter to file. If you're working in a larger company, maybe you put together a couple of people, and I'm not talking about dozens, but maybe 2 or 3 people, a regulatory person, an R&D person, maybe a manufacturing person, or a quality person from other areas of the company that would be responsible for reviewing your letter to file internally. In other words, they would not have been part of your that particular project. It's like the concept of it from the design controls I'm applying here is the concept of the independent reviewer, right? You don't want the same person that created the letter to file to be reviewing the letter to file. That would be just as bad as having an engineer who designed the product review the product. That defeats the entire purpose of having an independent review, right? So you can create, a small group of people in your company that will be your internal review team. Or if you don't have a company where you have other people like that, if you're working in a small company, many of my customers are very, very small or startup companies. They might not have the internal resources to do that. That's fine. Maybe ask a consultant like myself. I spend some of my time reviewing submissions to the FDA from a company prior to them submitting it to the FDA. In other words, why should a company consider or treat the FDA as their beta tester? Why should the FDA? Oh, sorry. Why should the first people outside of a company to see a submission be the FDA? To me, although that's what almost every company does, that makes absolutely no sense. So one of the things I do with companies that I work with, I'm not trying to be self-serving. I'm just trying to share some of my best practices here. Before they send their package to the FDA, they send it to me. I put my FDA reviewer hat on, and if I can be blunt here, bash the hell out of it. Because the idea is, if they're going to make a mistake, or if there's going to be a weakness in the submission, isn't it better for them to find out when they're dealing with me as opposed to when they're dealing with the FDA? And I'm not going to go quite so far as to say that if a company can get through me, then they can get through the FDA. But I can act as a pretty good surrogate, if you will, for the FDA in those kind of circumstances. I'm making exactly the same suggestion here when it comes to the letter to file. Have somebody not involved with that particular device, or at least not intimately involved with that particular device. Vet your letter to file. In other words, consider it part of your V&V, if you will, of your letter to file process. And kind of like having a third party inspector, a mock inspection, on the quality side. This is exactly the same thing on the regulatory side. I think, to me, it's not required. Perhaps it should be required, but to me, it's common sense. Bottom line, remember though, a letter to file is not a shortcut. That's exactly the kind of mentality that gets people into trouble. A letter to file is not a shortcut. It's got advantages, including it can be, less time for the reasons that we talked about before, but it is not a shortcut. It is not an excuse for sloppy engineering. It is not an excuse for not doing certain tests that you should do, and so on and so on, just because you feel that it's not necessary to take it to the FDA. That is we really don't want people in this industry who think that way, but regrettably, some people do think exactly that way. The last thing that I want to talk about, and then we're going to wrap this up and move on to our Q&A, is a little more on what's the relationship between change management and product liability. Remember, as I said earlier, the letter to file and similar documents, or the lack thereof, is the first place that I look when the product liability asks me to act as an expert witness. A lot of people in industry, they tell me that they fear the FDA. I say, no, 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 no. You should not fear the FDA. You should have a healthy respect for the FDA, but you should not fear them. Who should you fear? You should fear the product liability attorneys, because I guarantee a product liability attorney can impose a heck of a lot more damage to a company than the FDA ever would. And I also guarantee, because I work with some of these, I also guarantee that product liability attorneys are much better at getting documentation than FDA ever would be, right? So you should have a healthy respect for the FDA. Absolutely, no doubt about it. As one of my friends who used to be a senior reviewer at CDRH is fond of saying, a physician can kill patients one at a time, but an FDA reviewer can kill patients thousands at a time. And I really believe that. I think that more people should remember that. I'll say it one more time. An FDA reviewer a physician can kill patients one at a time, but an FDA reviewer can kill patients thousands at a time. That's something that everybody in this industry should remember. So you should definitely have a respect for the FDA, but don't fear them, don't worship them, don't put them up on a pedestal. Disagree with them if you feel that it's justified. But who should you fear? You should fear the product liability attorneys, because, as I said, they can impose a lot more damage to the company than the FDA can. So if you get sued, and as I said at the beginning, regrettably, it's just a fact of doing business in our country today, at least in the United States. Sooner or later, you probably will get sued. Can a letter to file be held against you? The short answer is absolutely yes, in a product liability sense, because the documents that are not submitted to the FDA, like a letter to file, are one of the first things that I ask for during discovery. Why? Because I love asking this kind of a question in this situation, because one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to give me their letter to file, and chances are something in it can be used against me, against them rather, or they're going to say, we don't have a letter to file, and I could use that against them as well. So it's kind of like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If they give me a letter to file, if I'll use it against them. If they don't give me a letter to file because they don't have one, then I'll use that against them. I love asking questions like that in a product liability sense. Now, again, please don't miss my message here. I'm not, I don't enjoy, treating medical device companies this way. But on the other hand, if we're going to call ourselves medical device professionals, along with that comes the responsibility. If a surgeon is doing surgery and he or she does something wrong or makes a mistake or whatever you want to call it, they need to be held accountable for their actions. Medical device companies and medical device professionals, I think most people, I hope, would agree, should be held to that same standard. So there's advantages and disadvantages of documentation like this. Martin Lamosi said that never write when you can speak, never speak if you can nod, and never nod if you can wink. Well, put another way, Eliot Spitzer, the former governor of New York, said that never talk when you can nod, never nod when you can wink, and never, ever, ever put something in the email because it's the kiss of death. You're giving the prosecutors all the evidence that we need. Again, I'm being kind of facetious, but I'm also being serious at the same time. From a regulatory or quality perspective, we want to document everything, but from a product liability perspective, we don't want to document anything. So obviously there's a bit of a balance in between there. Okay, so to wrap this up, and then a few final thoughts, and then we'll move on to some Q&A and some discussion. Final thoughts on the letter to file, not just the document, but the whole process. On the positive side, it does gives us more freedom to operate, especially in the class 2 and class 1 universes. In the class 3 universes we talked about, you have some freedom to operate, but not as much. It's certainly less formal in the sense that you're not formally submitting a document to the FDA. Some people might view that as a positive, but to me, when I put my name on a document, whether it's going to be an internal document that stays in the company or whether I'm going to send that out of the company to the FDA or to anywhere else, I want to be proud of that document. My name is on it. And so the formality for me, I put it on this list because a lot of people see it as a positive, but for me, it doesn't make that much a difference. In other words, for a document that's going to be held internally, does that mean that it's an excuse to be sloppy? It's an excuse not to have it be well prepared, not to have it be well written, well organized, well articulated, and so on. At the end of the day, if you're putting your name on it, I would hope that you want to be proud of it. And you should definitely, there should be a name, or maybe more than one name, but a person's name on all of these letter to file documents. It should not be just ambiguous from some company. There should be a name or a group of names. Maybe 3 different people need to sign off on it or something like that. And many people view it as quicker. As I said before, it's quicker in the sense that there's no time necessary for the FDA review or evaluation, but there is still the time that it takes us to prepare the information, to do the analysis, the testing, put it together, and so on. On the downside, there's no FDA review. The question is that a good thing? Remember, there is no sanity check. We're putting 100% of our eggs in one basket. And so if we're wrong, unless you take my advice that I shared with you earlier of having somebody in your company or having somebody from the outside like me review your letter to file, you're taking a big risk that maybe that letter to file might not be sufficient. And this is exactly why we don't allow companies the same degree of freedom in the class 3 universe that we do in the class 2, because quite frankly, the risks are higher. And that, in this case, I mean the risk to the patient. But for you in this audience, what I'm talking about is the risk to the company. So no FDA review, the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? And if you do not do a complete, a thorough letter to file. And I don't just mean the letter to file in the document sense. I'm talking about the whole process, kind of like for those of you that are familiar with clinical trials and informed consent. It's exactly the same kind of regulatory logic. Informed consent is not about a form. Anybody that thinks about informed consent as a form, they really don't understand this business. They shouldn't be working in this business. Informed consent is all about the process. The letter to file is exactly the same in that regard. It's not about a form or a document. It's about the process. It's about the form of the document is what an attorney would call the work product. In other words, what results from the process. But the whole process that you go through in doing the analysis and collecting that information and presenting that information and so on, that's the process. If you do that incompletely, or if you do it wrong, that can get you in big, big, big trouble, as we've talked about. So at the end of the day, my take on the letter to file is very simple. It's a very, very useful tool. I use it myself all the time. I recommend it to companies all the time. But there's an important caveat, and that is it's a very useful tool when it's used properly by people who know what they're doing in the right situation and so on. Just like a scalpel. A scalpel is a very useful tool when it's used in the hands of a skilled surgeon. In the hands of somebody else, it can inflict a lot of damage. Regulatory tools, like for example the letter to file, are exactly the same. So overall, it's the letter to file is kind of a mixed bag. It can be a real advantage for the medical device industry, and I think it should remain as a viable option for us to use, with that caveat that I just mentioned. When it's used in the proper circumstances by people who know what they're doing. But unfortunately, when it's used improperly, it can cause a lot of damage. So to wrap this up, we've talked a lot about the letter to file, what it is, when it should be used, what goes into it, how it compares to special 510Ks and PMA supplements. Can it be used in the class 3 universe? The advantages and disadvantages, is it faster, is it less burdensome? Even some of the product liability implications. Let me just very quickly end with a couple of final thoughts, and then Eddie, and if we have some questions from the audience, I'm happy to talk about those. There's a lot of regulatory consultants out there, but in my view, there's very, very few good ones. It's kind of like saying every surgeon has graduated from medical school, but does that mean that every surgeon is equally as good? Absolutely not. So how do you become a good regulatory consultant, or how do you find one if you need one? Very simple. Learn when to follow, but more importantly, learn when to lead. If it's to my advantage to follow in somebody else's footsteps, if it's to my advantage to create a letter to file the same way that the people have done it before me, then I'll be the first one to do that. And if I'm taking this to the FDA, I'll be the first one to put in my PowerPoint in 72-point font. This is exactly what I'm doing that's consistent with what people did before me. End of discussion. Don't let the door hit you until you know what on the way out. On the other hand, if it's not to my advantage to follow in somebody else's footsteps, or if it's not possible to follow in somebody else's footsteps, then I will be the first to work with the FDA if necessary, or work with the company if necessary to create a good letter to file. Because at the end of the day, if you want to lead the orchestra, you must first turn your back on the crowd. If you want to lead the orchestra, you must first turn your back on the crowd. And finally, don't just follow the rules. Think. This has become one of my regulatory mantra. Douglas MacArthur said that rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind. Now, please don't miss my message here. I'm not saying that rules are not important. I'm not saying don't follow the rules. I'm certainly not advocating anarchy. I'm certainly not saying, go out and start, changing your medical devices willy-nilly and never, ever, ever tell the FDA. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is this: if the rules make sense, then follow them. But if the rules don't make sense and we follow them anyway, and we agree that they don't make sense, and yet we follow them anyway, is that a problem with the system, or is that a problem with us? Every single week, almost every single day, as a regulatory consultant, but also as a professional biomedical engineer, I read rules, regulation, guidance that makes absolutely no sense, none whatsoever, and yet people follow it anyway. Is that a problem with the system, or is that a problem with us? let me just skip that one. This is the last one. If we're going to take inspiration, let's take inspiration from one of the best, Steve Jobs, who changed our world in some very profound ways, in some ways evolutionary ways, but in other ways revolutionary ways. Let me end this webinar today, and then we'll open this up to some questions with one of Steve Jobs' first ads from Apple Computer, where he talked about the crazy ones, the rebels. Watch this.
I don't know if we're hearing the sound.
Oh, we're not hearing the sound?
Don't believe.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, actually, you have you
Let's
have the
see.
text on the screen. I can just paraphrase it. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them, but about the only thing you cannot do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see them as genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. I know Steve Jobs did a better job saying it than I just did, but you get the idea. Now, I'm certainly not going to be so arrogant as to put myself in Steve Jobs' category, but when I did my presentation on competitive regulatory strategy in Anaheim a few years ago at the MD&M, one of the largest medical technology conferences in the world. One of the editors of MDDI magazine was in the audience, and she characterized me as a regulatory rebel. So in that context, maybe Steve Jobs might be proud. The very last quote I want to share to end our webinar today, and then we'll move on to questions. Imagine where we can be today if discontent for the status quo was the norm rather than the exception. Imagine where we could be today if discontent with the status quo was the norm rather than the exception. I don't know if anybody can guess who said this. If you've seen any of my presentations before, perhaps you have. I said this in one of my very first columns about a dozen years ago. Imagine where we can be today if discontent for the status quo was the norm rather than the exception. I don't care if we've been doing something a certain way for a very long time. I don't care if just about everybody does it that way. The question is, does it make sense? If it makes sense, then by all means, we should continue to do it. But if it doesn't make sense and we continue to do it anyway, is that a problem with the system or is that a problem with us? So at this point, I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. We're finishing exactly on time. We've got just about 15 minutes left for questions and discussion. Eddie, and I'll turn it over to you to facilitate that discussion. But I just want to thank once again everybody in the audience for listening, and a special thank you to my friends at Greenlight Guru for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today. If anybody has any questions or if there's anything I can do to help in the future, you have my contact information on the screen. Feel free to send me an email or give me a call. I'd be happy to help however I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was a fantastic presentation, and I'm echoing some of the people in the chat. I especially appreciate the 360-degree view of the FDA in contrast to product liability. Is very powerful. So really appreciate all of those context pieces. So we have a lot of questions. I'd say probably 50 or 60. I've tried to categorize them. One of the ones we probably have 10 or 12 related to the subject of cumulative changes. So I think the general theme seems to be, what if you have cumulative letters to file? What's the approach there? Thoughts?
Yeah, great question for that person or the people that asked that. And believe it or not, I had a slide in my presentation exactly on that I took out for the sake of time. What they're asking about is what I call change creep. So you make a change to a medical device. You determine that change is not significant enough to notify the FDA, and so you handle it via a letter to file. And then a little while later, you make another change to the same device, and you make the same determination that it's not necessary to tell the FDA, and you do a letter to file. And then a little while later, you do a third change, and so on and so on. So each of these changes, when you consider them individually, incrementally, the change may be justified to handle as a letter to file. However, when you now start to add these changes together over a period of months or years or sometimes even decades, these changes, when you add them together, those changes can be significant. So change creep in the letter to file is exactly analogous to predicate creep of the 510K. And predicate creep, I think, is the most significant criticism of the 510K today. We need to have a better solution than we have today. Here's my best solution for right now. If you make a change to your device via a letter to file, part of your procedure, this should be in your quality management system, is to take a retrospective look and see, have there been previous letter to files that have done without notifying the FDA? And if that's the case, make sure that you consider how this last change that you've made compares to the previous changes. In other words, not just that individual change, pardon me, but the sum of those changes to date. And if you then determine now that those changes, when you add them all together, are getting into that gray area that maybe you do need to notify the FDA, this is exactly when I would go to the FDA as a special 510K if it's a class 2 device. Unfortunately, we do not yet have what some people like myself call a catch-up 510K. We really need one. And I don't mean ketchup in the ketchup and mustard sense of the word. I mean ketchup in the sense of notifying FDA of all of the all of the previous changes that we've made to the device over time that we haven't notified FDA about. We need to have a catch-up 510K, but we don't have one yet. And if you submit something to the FDA called a catch-up 510K, they're going to throw it right back in your face because they don't know what to do with it. But that said, I refuse to use regulation as an excuse to hold us back. We need to figure out a way to notify the FDA. So here's exactly how I do it. In that particular case, if it's just a single change, I'm probably not going to do it with a special 510K. But if you have a sum of these changes, i.e. change creep, then I put them all together in a special 510K. Maybe each one of these changes by themselves doesn't warrant a special 510K, but maybe in the sum of them they do, and we send it to the FDA as a notification. And I will, if I do this, for example, as a pre-sub, I will say in the pre-sub, as a matter of professional courtesy, look, this is not really necessary to notify you as a special 510K. However, as a matter of professional courtesy, we want to do it anyway, because we want to make sure that you're aware of the changes that we've made and the reasons why and the testings that we've done. In other words, and as I said before, I want to make it painfully obvious to my FDA friends that I know what I'm doing, that I'm acting as a professional, that I'm not taking shortcuts. And finally, that just because FDA doesn't have a mechanism to take this to them, I'm going to figure out a way to get the square peg into the round hole anyway. Does that make sense?
I think so. Makes sense to me. Kind of a follow-up question, maybe it's industry specific, but for software, there are iterations that a software may go through while keeping one release on the market. Any advice on how to handle those changes, those different releases?
Yeah, again, great question. I'm doing more and more work, obviously, in the software area, SAMD, software as a medical device, and now more and more software as medical devices with artificial intelligence on top of all that. Look, are there differences between software devices versus other, physical devices? Absolutely. But in my opinion, there are not nearly as many differences as there are similarities. The way you change, pardon me, the way you handle change management, and one of the references that I provided in the webinar, and everybody will get it as part of the handout, is the guidance on, forget exactly what it's titled, but software change management for SAMDs. You still have to evaluate those changes to make sure that they're not going to impact the safety, efficacy, performance of the device, and so on. And so you still have to do that kind of testing. Maybe the way you do that testing is going to be a little different, but you still have to do that testing because it's, there's something called the law of unintended consequences that I learned as an engineer many, many years ago. And that is, if you have a large, complicated device or a very large, complicated program, if you make one small change to one part of the program, how do we know that that change is not having sort of a ripple effect, if you will, to other parts of the program as well? You need to do that kind of testing, and then ultimately, whether you notify the FDA or not, that's goes back to what we talked about earlier, and I would refer everybody to the change management webinar that I did that goes into that in more detail. This is exactly why FDA created the certification system that now about a dozen companies are part of, which will allow companies to make changes to software devices with more easily without having to go through the FDA. I love that model. In principle, I think it should be expanded to the entire medical device industry, not limited to just software. In other words, the certification is on the company, it's not on the device. In other words, once the company gets certified and the people in it get certified, then they're responsible and they can make whatever changes they want, essentially. It's kind of like, if you want to drive a car, you get a driver's license. You don't need special permission to drive your car from your house to the grocery store or to your work or to somewhere else. Your driver's license, when you graduate medical school and you become a surgeon, you get a license to do surgery or to fly an airplane. You don't get a license to do this surgery or that surgery. Well, why can't we use that same software certification model for the entire medical device industry? It's an interesting topic of discussion. I think John Spear and I did a podcast on that, exactly that topic, once upon a time.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much for that. Another question, this one's a little trickier and probably more specific to the device. What is your threshold for documenting a change in a full letter to file versus in a just PLM change order with shorter information?
Yeah, good question. The question is being directed to me, so I'll give you my opinion. It might not be consistent with other people's opinion. You've got to have enough information in there so that somebody who is not intimately familiar with your device is able to pick up this document and read it and understand it. It shouldn't be written only for people that are familiar with that particular device. That's another reason why so many companies get in trouble, because you might not be working at this company for forever. You might move to another company next week, or God forbid you walk out the door and you get hit by a bus. So these documents, whether it's a letter to file or anything else, these documents need to be written with a level of detail that a general person can understand. That's my sort of threshold. I suspect that maybe other people might set that threshold perhaps a bit lower, but that's my threshold. If you keep the bar at that point, I think you'll be in good shape. One of the most common questions I get from companies, whether we're talking about a letter to file or a pre-submission package or a final submission or anything else, how much detail do we need to put into this document? If it's a letter to file that's going to remain internally, how much detail do we put into a document like a pre-sub or a submission if it's going to the FDA? There's absolutely no answer to that question. There really isn't. The best answer I can give you is put yourself in the shoes of whoever's going to be reading it. Is there enough information such that somebody who is not familiar with your device can sit down and read it and understand it and say, yeah, this makes sense, and hopefully, this is the icing on the cake, hopefully they'll come to the same conclusion that you did. In other words, here's all the reasons why we made this change and all the reasons why we're not notifying the FDA. And hopefully after reading this document, the person will say, yeah, gee, that makes sense, I agree. That's exactly where I would set that threshold. Ian, how does that sound?
Okay, no, that makes sense. One other question. There was a little bit about risk management. That is kind of covered in the guidance, but one person specifically asked about how to assess whether a device change impacts efficacy and some of the other factors. Do you have any thoughts or opinions on that?
So the question is specifically on efficacy or
how to assess whether a device change impacts the efficacy of the device.
Okay, well, it's a good question. It's a little hard to answer in sort of a general sense. First and foremost, efficacy is usually not the first thing that people get concerned about. It's usually the opposite. It's usually the safety and risk. And safety and risk are just, opposites of the same coin, right? So assuming that we're not talking about safety or risk and we're talking about efficacy, that's an interesting question from a regulatory perspective, Edian, because for a 510K, there's no requirement to show that your device is safe and effective. A lot of people think that there is, but it doesn't exist. Instead, you have to show that your device is substantially equivalent or basically the same as another device that's already on the market. And the regulatory logic, I'm not suggesting that I agree with it. I think it's in fact weak logic, but the regulatory logic is if the other device is on the market, it's assumed to be safe and effective. If my device is basically the same as the other device, then my device is assumed to be safe and effective. In other words, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So strictly speaking, one could argue from a letter to file perspective that there is no obligation, if you will, to reassess efficacy after the change. I personally think that would be a weak argument. I would like to think that as a medical professional, we would assess efficacy. How exactly we do that, that kind of depends on the situation. But let me give you a specific example. One company came to me, this was several years ago. They manufactured a catheter, and they wanted to do nothing more than move the logo of the company from one side of the hub of the catheter to the other side of the hub of the catheter. Because when the cardiologist used this catheter, before they moved the logo was facing down. Nobody saw it. And of course, the marketing people were very upset about that. So the company wanted to do nothing more than literally move the logo to the other side. Most people would think, oh my gosh, what a trivial change. We don't have to go through any analysis. We don't have to notify the FDA. Well, long story short, Eddie, and because the company was working with me, and we went through some analysis, I'm not talking about like a 5-year PhD dissertation here, but we went through some analysis. It did turn out that that seemingly trivial change of moving the logo from one side of the catheter to the other did impact, excuse me, did impact the way that that catheter was used. And as a result, could impact the safety and also the efficacy of the device. And so in that particular case, the company took the more conservative approach and notified the FDA. But if the company didn't go through that analysis, they would have never known. And then they would have been setting themselves up for a possibility of that, somebody getting harmed and getting sued, or, getting pinged on an FDA inspection, and so on and so on. So I know that was a very long-winded answer to the question. I hope there was an answer in there somewhere, but hope that helps.